You're listening to Season 2 of Conversations with Kathy, the podcast for women who are looking for a place filled with honest conversations, tangible takeaways, and new perspectives on life, love, and everything in between. And I'm your host, Kathy Ann Roach. Let's jump right in. I don't know about you, but COVID has forced me to turn my mental health game all the way up. I found myself having to deal with anxiety like I've never had to before. So I was excited to chat with Sarah Falk. Sarah, a cancer survivor, therapist, author, and coach, says that she has struggled with chronic worry and anxiety for years. She also said, I've allowed it to suck the joy out of my life. But now her mission is to teach others how to put an end to the drain of anxiety and to rediscover joy. She is the host of the Worry Less Living podcast. So let's jump into my conversation with Sarah. So Sarah, thank you so much for agreeing to chat with me. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Happy to talk with you.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this is a very interesting subject, and it's a very personal subject for me because we're here to talk about health anxiety. And I think living in the middle of COVID, I was telling someone yesterday, I said, you know what? 2020, I think I was coping. It was hard, but I was coping. But then along with COVID came life continued to happen, even though there was COVID, right? And I still had issues of friends getting ill, with cancer, with relationships breaking up. And all of a sudden, it started to feel even overwhelming for me. And I started to struggle with my own feelings of anxiety around my health and everything else. So that's why I'm so happy to have you talk about your experience, to share your personal journey, and hopefully give me some tips to cope.
Yes. Absolutely.
So Sarah, just tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, health anxiety and I go way back. Mm-hmm. I was diagnosed with cancer for the first time when I was 17 years old.
Oh.
And I was entering into my final year of high school in the States. And I was having knee pain and found bone cancer in my left femur.
Oh.
So for a year, I went through chemotherapy treatments and surgeries. And as a pediatric, they treat pediatric cancers very aggressively. So I counted one time and I had 54 chemotherapy treatments and they were all inpatient.
Wow.
So for 54 weeks, I was in the hospital.
Wow. What's that? Oh my God.
Yes.
Yeah. So that would have totally, in terms of school and everything else, that was just
that's
put on hold.
That's right. And my teachers worked with me and I was able to do a lot of the classes remotely, even back then.
Yes.
So that was a long time ago.
Yeah.
But they helped me so that I could, do some reading and write papers and didn't have to be in the class because I just couldn't be.
Yeah. So you're 17 years old and you're dealing with a cancer diagnosis. And then, that would have, like you said, triggered your feelings of what, scared. You are now afraid. Tell me,
Yeah. So I noticed in myself, I had been a very adventurous teenager.
Yeah.
I had traveled many places already in my young life for creative writing.
Yeah.
So I was a writer ever since I could hold a pencil or a pen, I was writing.
Yeah.
Writing through all my experiences, and cancer was similar. After having cancer, I found that I was staying very close to home. I didn't really want to go branch out anywhere. A lot of my friends were leaving for university. I did not. I wanted to stay at home and, where everything was comfortable and safe. And I didn't recognize it as anxiety for a while. But then in my mid-20s, I started having panic attacks.
Right.
And I had actually ended up going to university and becoming a medical social worker and working with cancer patients and their families. And I was having panic attacks every single day.
Wow.
To the point where I had to quit my job.
What was triggering the attacks?
I came to realize that I cannot address cancer all day. It was all day, every day, all cancer. So I was a mental health therapist there and a clinical events coordinator.
Yes.
And every day was about cancer from start to finish. And so for me, while it was good work, I just had to leave that work for people who weren't triggered by the topic of cancer. I had to step back.
Yeah. Is it that you were feeling, okay, if this person has cancer, that means my cancer can come back? Is that what was triggering your panic attacks?
Possibly just the fear of the potential of it and knowing that I couldn't control it. Because anxiety in any form, whether it's health anxiety, social anxiety, etc., at its core wants to have control.
Yes.
So we're grasping everything. And I'm clenching my fists as I'm talking about this because that's what anxiety does to us. It binds us up and we don't move forward unless we have the perfect plan and we think we're in control.
Yes, very much so. I think sometimes we would do what we think we need to do to make sure that we're all right. So say, for example, let's say it's health anxiety. So you think, okay, I'm going to go to your doctor. I get these tests, for example, and the test comes back and says I'm okay. But health anxiety sometimes goes, well, are you sure?
Right. Or maybe you should get a second opinion or a third opinion or a fifth opinion.
And then you're spiraling. So, all right. So now you've quit this job. What are you feeling? What are you doing now?
I was home. I was home for a month and realized I was a mental health therapist. So I had been in denial about the panic attacks for so long. And finally, once I was able to admit it, I created a self-care plan for myself.
Right.
And that included anti-anxiety medication for a while. That included limiting the external stimulants, like the kind of music I listened to. I changed that. Or the kind of TV shows I watched or the books I read. I also altered some of the foods I was taking in because we consume caffeine, alcohol, sugar. Those are all stimulants. They all increase our cortisol level, which triggers our anxiety or is part of that anxiety process in our body. And so I tried to make some of those very practical changes for myself to try to recover. To heal myself from these panic attacks and to get to a place of functioning again because I wasn't even functioning.
Yeah. Can you tell me a little bit about the medication side? Because I was actually talking to someone today and he was saying to me, one of the issues that the person that he is in contact with is they're afraid to take medication. So when you're taking medication, what is it doing exactly?
So I would say even before taking prescription medication, there are some over-the-counter medications you can take and you can try before you even, maybe that's the first step before seeking prescription. I've learned more since then.
Yes.
And so there are a couple things to kind of watch out for. One would be a low vitamin D level.
Right.
Because that impacts your mood and can trigger that anxiety. And then B12 level. So trying maybe some of those supplements over the counter can be very helpful, including, and so for people who have anxiety and having trouble sleeping, that might include something like melatonin. or magnesium, because magnesium also has a relaxing effect.
Now, this is not the one that gets your stomach and makes you run to the bathroom, right? Not that magnesium.
No, well, and you do want to watch out for that. You don't want to take too much,
Right.
That does have that effect too. Yes. If you take too much, your body will tell you.
Yes. Because for me, sometimes I think, because I'm thinking I was never the type of person that felt that I suffered with anxiety, but for people who have listened to the podcast before, they would know that I lost my dad very young. So my father, the closer I get to his age, I realize that, is it now I'm feeling more and more anxious. And then COVID it came and it hit, and everything else started happening. And then all of a sudden, I started to feel very anxious about health. I started to feel like, okay, suppose this has happened to this person. Suppose it happens to me. So suddenly I'm always going to a place of suppose it's happened to me. And I started feeling as though I started reading up everything on health anxiety and all of these sorts of things, because I started to feel more and more concerned. And I found myself doing, just like you're saying, things, preventing myself from going to do things. Simple things. So I was telling my girlfriend, I said, I needed to change my glasses. And I'm like, I don't want to go do that because, they might find something. So I'm very conscious of it. So I can imagine you, like I said, actually being a mental health, somebody who specializes in it, to then see it happening to you and you're recognizing it, that it's happening.
Yeah.
And now you're trying to treat it. So how did that turn out?
So it took me about a year to kind of right the ship, so to speak, where I was finally feeling more myself. And I actually, so the medication I was on was actually, eventually I felt like it was suppressing those anxious feelings, those heightened feelings, but then I was feeling more depressed. So finally, I just kind of weaned off of that medication to see how things were going. And I had implemented so many different changes, because we can't just throw a medication at it and it's done, it's all better. It's more about, there's mindset shifts and lifestyle alterations that all promote this peace of mind, honestly.
Yeah.
And understanding that the stress response, it's not our enemy. We want to make friends with it because it's an an instinctual response to any perceived threat. And so it's just our system, our inner wisdom trying to keep us safe.
Right.
So one of the things that I like to do and have learned to do, because I still deal with anxiety, even to this day.
Yeah.
I just say, oh, there you are. I recognize you, thank you for trying to keep me safe, but there's nothing to see here. There's nothing to worry about right now.
Yes. When you talked about medication, you were talking about the prescription medication in terms that made you a little too dull and not as responsive, right? Yeah. Right. So we want to be clear about that. But when you go into, we're talking about this part of your brain that's probably hyperactive and hyper aware of everything. And sometimes there's an immediate response, meaning that mind-body response. So if you're physical, you have an immediate, oh, my stomach is hurting, or I'm feeling fearful, and now my body is responding to that. Is there any way that you can, because it's mind, body one time. It's as though you don't get a chance to sneak in and go, okay, hold up. It's nothing to be afraid of here, because it triggers a physical response. I am assuming that with time, you kind of tend to learn how to do what you do with time in terms of getting in between your mind and by the time it hits your gut.
And even when you have a physical response, because that's really good. I like how you say that you're in this hyper aware state.
Yes.
And so sometimes you're not even cognizant, and all of a sudden you're like, oh my goodness, my stomach, you're having that physical response.
Yes.
And even in that moment, I feel like taking a deep breath, and breathing down into your abdomen, not just sighing, not just, huffing. It has to be that nice therapeutic breath down into the abdomen to release some of that tension. Because you're right, there is a physical response, and we're not always aware ahead of time in advance of it.
Yeah.
So there are things that you can do to address that physical response in the moment.
Because I had something that happened to me actually today. A friend of mine had emergency surgery about a month ago, right? And then, of course, coming out of the surgery, they said they found a lump and they didn't know whether the lump was cancerous or not. So on one hand, they were telling him it is cancer, but then they still needed to run some more tests to confirm that it's cancer. And then another doctor said, well, it isn't cancer. So he didn't know. So then they decided that they said to him, well, we call you this weekend. So he gets called yesterday and they're like, okay, fine, you're set for cancer treatment. And he's like, how am I set for cancer treatment? Nothing has been confirmed. So this is him calling me today to tell me about this interaction that he had. And he said, they called me and they said, I have to go in for cancer treatment. And I immediately feel this whole surge of anxiety come over me. And yes, it hits me. It hits my stomach. I'm feeling. And he goes on to say, well, no, then we had the conversation and they said it's a mistake. They didn't update my file. And no, I don't have cancer. Yeah, and I don't have cancer and I'm fine. And
you could have bled with that.
Exactly. But Sarah, he's gone on to, well, I don't have cancer and I'm fine. And I am still stuck in this moment of, I can't just like, oh, okay, cool. We don't have cancer. I'm stuck there in this shock and in this uncomfortable physical experience.
Yeah.
So I'm like, this is horrible. Right? I know that there's a lot of work to be done once your mind gets into that space. And it seems to, again, like your mind have a mind of its own, Sarah.
Right.
I know that you've said to me on our last conversation that you have to go back and get continually checked for cancer. So I am assuming that gets your anxiety a little, it shows up again when that time comes up again.
Right. This is true. And I didn't say earlier that years after bone cancer, I was actually diagnosed with breast cancer.
Oh, gosh.
So I've had bone cancer, breast cancer, and 2 different types of skin cancer.
Ooh.
So I've dealt with cancer over and over and over again. And so, and actually I have a scan again tomorrow.
Yeah.
So you're right. The anxiety comes back up. And I think being aware of those feelings and just recognizing it, like my stomach is already in knots and I know what that's about. I know I'm nervous about tomorrow, but I also know tomorrow I'm going to get up. I'm going to go to the hospital. I'm going to have the test.
Yeah.
And I may still feel anxious afterwards as I'm waiting for results, but I know this.
Yes.
And I know what it's about. And I think that when we can just remind ourselves, even in those uncomfortable moments, this is my body. This is my system trying to warn me, trying to protect me. And then doing the things that you can do to kind of bring in relaxation and calm and bring that cortisol level down, because we've got adrenaline and cortisol that are just,
yes.
And so trying to bring those things down, those chemical levels down, but also that tension, right? To release that tension. So it's mind, body, spirit.
Yeah. What would you say to someone, because we've been talking about health anxiety, but I'm assuming generalized anxiety, it's similar in terms of somebody dealing with generalized anxiety. Is there any difference? So how does that show up?
I would say that there really isn't a difference because it comes from the same place. It's that primitive brain, the amygdala, where that any perceived threat in our environment is going to trigger that chemical reaction of cortisol and adrenaline. And then we're going to have sweaty palms and we're going to feel jittery and we just stomach it, you know, all of those things. And that perceived threat is any change in our environment. So even if you're planning a trip or you're planning a wedding, you know, planning good things, exciting things, your brain, that primitive brain doesn't differentiate between, quote, good and bad stress. So I think it's, you know, just being aware that, okay, this is where this is coming from. And however it, reveals itself, whether it be, or however it's triggered, right? Because it could be health, it could be social interactions, it could be just a generalized sense of anxieties.
So what would you recommend for someone who is struggling with anxiety or any type of anxiety? What are some of the techniques that you have found useful?
Therapeutic deep breathing is one of the main techniques, I would say. It helps your mind to focus on something other than those racing thoughts or the things that you're so fixated on. And it actually calms your muscles, you know, releases some of that tension in your muscles. But also what's happening when you take that therapeutic deep breath down into your abdomen is you are massaging the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is the longest nerve in our body. And it communicates directly from gut to brain. So when we're massaging the vagus nerve, one of the roles of the vagus nerve is to activate the relaxation response. So taking a deep breath, I feel, is extremely powerful and very underestimated.
Okay. So this is a deep breath through your nose and out your mouth? What kind of deep breath are we talking about here? In through the nose and out through the mouth?
In through the nose, and thinking about breathing down almost to your belly button, if not below.
Okay.
Because you want to feel your abdomen expand, you don't want your chest to rise. You want your abdomen to expand. And then slow and controlled exhales through the nose or through the mouth.
Okay. What about meditation? What do you think about that?
The way that I like to practice meditation is to focus on a quote, a scripture, even a word. And just to focus on that one thing. I know there are many different ways to practice meditation, you know, whatever is most comfortable for the practitioner. So, but I think that works too, because that's a mindset shift. We go into meditation, and if we're going to focus on this one word, that doesn't mean other thoughts aren't going to pop in. But the way I like to think about it is, imagine your thoughts as clouds. When you're a little kid, you know how sometimes you lay out in the grass and you look up at the clouds and you make pictures of the clouds and stuff. And then they change and then they float on by and they're gone. Same with our thoughts. Recognize the thought, but then let it go. Right. And hold on to the one word, the scripture, the quote that you want to keep as the focus. And that's just kind of a peaceful picture to enter into meditation with. And hopefully that helps the process, because a lot of people are like, I can't clear my mind, or I can't say, I can't meditate, I just can't focus. But sometimes using that exercise helps them to focus.
When should you seek medical help?
If it is impairing your functioning, if your anxiety is keeping you from basic activities of daily living. Or you see that that's your tendency or you're leaning toward it, that is a great time to go.
As we close, is there anything that you'd want to share for the person who's listening and who may be struggling with anxiety?
Everyone, I would imagine, in their lifetime, whether they recognize it or not, will experience this anxiety at some point, because the human brain is built that way. I have just started coaching, and I'm coaching people because I have my mental health practice, the the counseling practice, but moving into coaching, because there are people who don't have a clinical diagnosis.
Yeah.
And there are people who have already been through counseling and feel like they're still worried, or they're still worrying. And what did I do wrong? Or what can I do differently?
Yeah.
And so I would just say, remembering that you're not broken. There's not something wrong with you. This is a natural process. And then seeking the support you need. If you haven't been to therapy, maybe therapy is the way. If you've been to therapy or feel like that's a little too clinical, or you might not have a diagnosis, then coaching can be very helpful to help you make those moderate lifestyle shifts and the mindset shifts and just those little tweaks that can move that needle for you in a big way with anxiety. It's a natural process. Don't judge yourself, but learning more about yourself, what your triggers are and what calms you.
Yeah. And of course, you're not alone. Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Conversations with Kathy. If you like the show, be sure to subscribe, rate, and review. It helps others just like you to find the show. And if you want to connect with me, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram as Kathy Ann Roach, or in my Facebook group, Conversations with Kathy, where we connect live, discuss the episodes, and share tips for improving our lives. So until next time.